He always believed marriages don't fall apart overnight. They weaken little by little, with small cracks that grow wider when no one pays attention. At first, he thought his wife's distant behavior was just stress from work or the usual struggles that come with daily life. She seemed tired more often, less talkative, and strangely protective of her phone. In the beginning, he brushed it off. Everyone has phases, he told himself. People change as they get older, and sometimes partners go through ups and downs. But the small signs became harder to ignore. The late-night text notifications she hid from him, the sudden work meetings that stretched into long evenings, and the way she avoided eye contact. Whenever he asked casual questions, it all started to feel like pieces of a puzzle falling into place. He wasn't the kind of man who jumped to conclusions. In fact, he was known among his friends for being patient, calm, and understanding. But deep down, his instincts told him something wasn't right. One night, when his wife was in the shower, he saw her phone light up. He didn't intend to snoop, but his eyes caught a glimpse of a message preview. It wasn't what a friend would send. It was something far more personal, filled with affection. His heart sank. From that moment, his world shifted. The woman he trusted the most, the one he built his life with, was sharing herself with someone else. The thought made him restless. He couldn't sleep properly, couldn't eat without feeling a knot in his stomach. He tried to confront her gently at first, but she dismissed his questions with excuses. "You're overthinking, it's just work stuff. You don't trust me anymore." Each excuse sounded weaker than the last. So he decided to find out the truth for himself. Quietly, carefully, he began observing. He noticed patterns. Certain days she came home later than usual. Certain excuses repeated like a script. His patience turned into determination. If his wife had chosen another man, then he wanted to know who that man was. It didn't take long before he discovered the truth. The man was someone he had seen before, though not very closely. They moved in similar social circles, attended some of the same gatherings, and even shared a few acquaintances. He was married too, with a reputation for being charming and friendly. On the surface, he looked like the kind of man who had it all: a stable career, a beautiful wife, and a seemingly happy life. But behind that polished image, he was living a double life. The betrayal cut deeper when he realized it wasn't just about his marriage. It was about another woman's marriage too. There was someone else, completely unaware, living her life with trust in her husband, never knowing he was sneaking behind her back. That thought made his blood boil, not out of anger, but out of empathy. He knew the pain of betrayal firsthand, and he couldn't imagine how devastated she would feel if she ever found out. For weeks, he carried this heavy secret. He didn't tell anyone, not his closest friends, not his family. It was like a storm brewing inside him, and he had to decide what to do with it. Should he confront his wife directly again? Should he meet the man privately? Or should he tell the man's wife the truth? Each choice had consequences, and none of them were easy. The turning point came unexpectedly. A friend of theirs invited him and his wife to a large party, a social gathering, where many people from their circle would be present. As he scanned the guest list, his eyes froze. Both the man and his wife would be there. The thought made his pulse race. For the first time, he felt like fate had handed him an opportunity. It wasn't just a party anymore, it was the stage where truth could finally come out. He imagined what it would feel like to look into the eyes of the man's wife and tell her everything. He pictured her reaction, the shock, the heartbreak, the confusion. But more than that, he imagined the look on his wife's face when she realized her secret could no longer be hidden. The days leading up to the party felt like an eternity. He acted normal around his wife, pretending he didn't know anything. Inside, though, his mind was busy planning every step. He didn't want to cause a scene just for the sake of drama. He wanted the truth to come out in a way that couldn't be twisted or denied. A calm, deliberate confrontation, one that would leave no space for lies. By the time the evening of the party arrived, he was ready. He put on his best suit, looked at himself in the mirror, and took a deep breath. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about dignity, about standing up for himself, and about giving another woman the truth she deserved. He knew what he was about to do would shock everyone, but he also knew he couldn't stay silent any longer. As they drove to the party, his wife chatted casually, unaware of what was coming. She laughed at small things, adjusted her dress, and carried on as though their marriage was perfectly normal. But he remained quiet, holding his emotions close. Tonight, everything would change, and as he stepped into the glittering hall, surrounded by music, laughter, and sparkling lights, his eyes immediately searched for the couple. There they were, the man and his wife, standing gracefully together, smiling at guests as if nothing was wrong. For a moment, he felt his anger flare, but then he steadied himself. He had waited for this moment, and now it was finally here. The party was already buzzing with laughter, clinking glasses, and cheerful music when he walked in with his wife. From the outside, everything looked normal, but inside, his heart was beating like a drum. He wasn't nervous out of fear, he was nervous because he knew what he was about to do would change everything forever. He watched as people mingled in small groups, catching up on gossip, discussing work, and sharing stories. His wife drifted away almost immediately, joining a group of friends near the bar. He stood for a moment, scanning the room, and then he saw them. The man his wife's secret lover stood just a few feet away, looking as confident as ever. His arm was casually resting around his wife's shoulders, as if he were the most devoted husband in the room. She looked radiant, smiling warmly, completely unaware of the storm about to hit her life. For a moment, he studied them quietly. The contrast between appearances and reality was painful. Here was a couple admired by so many, held up as an example of a perfect marriage, while in truth, half of that relationship was rotten with deceit. His jaw tightened, but he reminded himself of the plan. No shouting, no messy fight, just the truth, plain and simple, delivered in the right moment. He grabbed a glass of water from a waiter passing by and tried to appear relaxed, but his eyes never left the couple. He noticed the way the man glanced around the room, careful but quick, as if checking whether his own secret might somehow spill out tonight. It was subtle, but he caught it. Guilt has a way of showing itself in tiny gestures that as he made his way across the hall, he bumped into an old acquaintance. They exchanged a few words, but his mind was elsewhere. The man's wife was now standing alone, speaking to another guest, while her husband slipped away toward the buffet. This was the chance. He approached slowly, his heart pounding, but his face calm. "Good evening," he said with a polite smile. She turned to him, her eyes lighting up with recognition. They had met a few times before, always in passing, but never had a proper conversation. "Hi," she replied warmly. "It's been a while. How are you?" He hesitated only for a second before answering. "I'm fine, thank you. I actually wanted to talk to you for a moment, if you don't mind." Somewhere a bit quieter, her brows furrowed slightly, but she nodded. They stepped aside to a corner near the balcony, away from the crowd and music. She seemed curious but not suspicious. He took a deep breath. "This was it. There's something important you need to know," he began carefully, his voice steady but gentle. "And I think it's only fair you hear it from me, rather than discovering it later." She tilted her head, confusion in her eyes. "What do you mean?" He looked directly into her eyes, his words sharp but calm. "Your husband and my wife, they've been seeing each other for months." Her face went blank at first, as if her brain refused to process the words. Then the color drained from her cheeks. She shook her head slowly. No, that can't be true. I wish it wasn't," he said quietly. "But I've seen the messages, the excuses, the late nights. I kept silent because I wasn't sure what to do. But tonight, I couldn't stand by any longer while you smiled, unaware of the truth." For a few seconds, she simply stared at him, blinking rapidly as if the world around her had frozen. Then, suddenly, her hands trembled as she covered her mouth. "Oh my God," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. The noise of the party continued around them, laughter, music, clinking glasses, but in that corner, everything felt painfully silent. She turned slightly, her gaze searching the crowd until she found her husband, laughing at some joke near the buffet. Her lips quivered. He's with your wife?" she finally asked, her voice breaking. He nodded slowly. "Yes." For a long moment, she didn't speak. She just stood there, stunned, her world collapsing in real time. Then her expression shifted. The sadness in her eyes hardened into something else, betrayal mixed with anger. She straightened her posture, wiping her tears quickly, as if refusing to let anyone see her weakness. "I can't believe this," she muttered. "All this time. I know how it feels," he replied softly. "I'm living it too. But you deserve to know the truth. And so does everyone else who believes in the lies they've been telling." She took a deep breath, steadying herself. And then, to his surprise, she looked straight at him with determination. "Then let's not hide it anymore." He wasn't expecting her to be so bold, but in that moment, he realized she was stronger than she appeared. Together, they walked back toward the center of the room. The man was still at the buffet, holding a drink, smiling casually, completely unaware of what was coming. As they approached, conversations began to pause. People noticed the serious look on their faces, the way the woman's hands trembled slightly, the way he walked with silent resolve. The atmosphere shifted, though no one yet knew why. He stopped a few steps away from the man. Catching his eye, the man froze for half a second, recognition flashing across his face. Perhaps he already sensed what was about to happen. The woman, standing beside him, took a deep breath. Her voice trembled, but it was loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Do you want to tell them where you've really been spending your late nights? Or should I?" The room fell silent. The man's smile disappeared. His hand holding the drink tightened, his knuckles turning white. Around them, guests exchanged confused looks, leaning closer, sensing something big was about to unfold. And just like that, the carefully built facade of perfection began to crack. The silence in the room felt heavier than the music that had just stopped mid-song. Conversations froze, laughter died out, and all eyes slowly turned toward the small group at the center of the hall. It was one of those moments where time seemed to stretch, every second dragging longer than it should. The woman stood tall, though her hands trembled at her sides. She looked directly at her husband, her voice rising louder this time, filled with both pain and fury. "Tell them," she demanded. "Tell everyone what you've been doing behind my back." The man's face turned pale. He glanced around, clearly calculating what excuse he could invent fast enough to stop the walls from closing in. He chuckled nervously, lifting his glass as if this were some kind of misunderstanding. "Honey, you're making a scene. Let's talk about this later, privately." But she shook her head firmly, her eyes blazing. "No, we'll talk about it now. Everyone should know who you really are." The crowd shifted, whispers spreading like wildfire. Guests leaned in closer, curious and stunned. Some tried to act polite and look away, but they couldn't resist the drama unfolding right in front of them. And then it happened. The man's wife turned her gaze toward the other woman in the room. His wife. The wife who had been standing quietly with her friends just moments earlier, unaware of the confrontation building around her. When their eyes met, panic spread across her face instantly. Her smile vanished, replaced by the kind of guilt that words couldn't cover. The man's wife stepped forward, pointing directly at her. "Is it true? Were you with my husband?" The room fell into an even deeper silence. His wife's lips parted, but no words came out. She tried to stammer something, anything, but the shame was written all over her face. She didn't need to confess. The silence was the confession. Gasps filled the hall. Some people covered their mouths. Others exchanged wide-eyed glances. The truth, so carefully hidden for months, had just exploded in the most public way possible. He stood a little apart, watching it unfold. This was the moment he had prepared for. He didn't gloat, didn't smile with satisfaction. He only stood steady, his expression calm, while his wife's world unraveled in front of everyone. The cheating man finally tried to step in, desperate to control the damage. "Listen, everyone, this is a misunderstanding. We're all friends here. Let's not jump to conclusions." But his wife cut him off with a sharp voice. "That silence, even the whispers. Enough lies. I've just been told everything by him." She pointed to the betrayed husband, standing silently at her side. "He showed me the truth, and now you're going to admit it in front of everyone." All eyes turned toward him for a moment. The quiet man who had been wronged, the one who finally spoke up. For months, he had been invisible, keeping his pain private. But now he was the one holding the truth like a torch in the dark. He took a step forward, his voice calm but clear. "Yes, it's true. My wife and your husband have been seeing each other behind our backs. I stayed quiet for too long. But tonight, I couldn't let it continue. You all deserve to know what kind of people you're celebrating." His words echoed in the hall. No one dared to interrupt. His wife gasped, her eyes pleading. "Please stop. Don't do this here." Her voice cracked, desperation written across her face. But he didn't look at her. Instead, he turned his gaze toward the crowd. For months, they thought they could fool us all. Smile in public, lie in private. But secrets don't stay hidden forever. The truth has a way of showing itself, no matter how hard you try to bury it. The man's wife broke down then, tears streaming down her face as she turned to her husband. "How could you do this to me, to us?" Her voice cracked as she choked back sobs. "We built a life together, and you threw it away for this." The cheating man had no answer. He stammered, looked down, then finally set his drink aside, unable to meet her eyes. The weight of shame pressed down on him, and for the first time, his confident smile disappeared completely. Guests murmured, some shaking their heads, others whispering in disbelief. A few quietly slipped away, not wanting to witness more of the chaos, but most stayed rooted, unable to look away from the raw human drama playing out. The betrayed husband stood quietly as his wife's tears welled up too. Though hers weren't tears of remorse, they were tears of exposure. She had built her lies carefully, but now they were crumbling faster than she could hold them together. She reached for his arm desperately, whispering, "Please, can we talk about this later? Please don't humiliate me like this." But he gently pulled his arm away, his expression firm. "You already did that yourself." The man's wife, still trembling, took a step back. Her whole body shook, but her voice was strong when she spoke. "We're done. Do you hear me? We are done." Her words struck like thunder. The room gasped again, and even the band near the stage exchanged uneasy looks, unsure whether to resume playing or not. And just like that, the party, the celebration, that was supposed to be filled with joy turned into a stage for heartbreak, betrayal, and truth. No one was laughing anymore. No one was smiling. Everyone was watching the fallout, stunned that something so dramatic could happen in such a glamorous setting. For the betrayed husband, it wasn't about revenge in that moment. It was about clarity. The truth was out, and there was no going back. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't created chaos. He had simply spoken the truth. And the truth had done the rest. The room no longer felt like a party. The chandeliers still glowed. The music still hummed faintly in the background. But the energy had completely changed. What had started as an evening of laughter and dancing had turned into a battlefield of whispers, sharp glances, and uncomfortable silence. The betrayed husband stood still in the center, his calmness a sharp contrast to the storm he had just unleashed. He didn't have to say anything more. The truth was already out. His wife stood beside him, her face pale, her eyes wide with panic, while the other man tried to grab hold of his own collapsing dignity. But it was the other woman, the wife of the cheating man, who now held everyone's attention. She wasn't quiet anymore. Her voice rose above the uneasy chatter as she addressed her husband. "You lied to me. You looked me in the eye every single day and told me you loved me. And all this time, you were laughing behind my back." The man reached out to calm her, his voice low. "Please, let's not do this here. People are watching." She pulled away sharply, her eyes burning with fury. "Exactly. People are watching, and they should know who you really are. Mr. Perfect Husband, Mr. Loyal Friend. Look at you now." Her words cut through the air, each one like a knife. Some guests awkwardly shifted in their seats, unsure if they should intervene. Others pretended to look at their phones, trying to avoid the tension, but still listening closely. It was the kind of drama no one wanted to admit they enjoyed, yet no one could walk away from. Meanwhile, his wife, the one who had been caught, finally spoke up. Her voice was shaky, pleading. "Please, can we just go home and talk about this? This isn't the place. Everyone doesn't need to know our private lives." But he shook his head firmly. His voice was calm, steady, but filled with disappointment. "Our private lives stopped being private the moment you chose to lie in them. You didn't just betray me, you betrayed every smile we showed in public. You made our marriage a performance. And tonight, the curtain finally dropped." His words sent a murmur through the crowd. Some nodded quietly, impressed by the way he handled himself without yelling. Others whispered judgments, taking sides, some blaming the cheaters, some pitying the betrayed. The cheating man, now sweating, tried to salvage something. "All right, enough of this. Everyone's exaggerating. Mistakes happen. Relationships are complicated. Let's not ruin friendships over something that should be handled in private." That was the wrong thing to say. The betrayed husband finally turned to face him directly. His voice was low, but strong enough for everyone to hear. "You call this a mistake? A mistake is forgetting an anniversary. A mistake is saying something hurtful and regretting it. What you did wasn't a mistake. It was a choice, and you made it over and over again." The crowd gasped softly, admiring the sharpness of his words. Even those who had once admired the cheating man now looked at him with suspicion, some shaking their heads in disapproval. The man's wife, still trembling, added, "And don't you dare say we should handle this in private. You didn't care about privacy when you snuck around behind my back. You had no shame then, so don't ask for it now." Her voice broke at the end, but she stood tall, her strength holding her upright. She had been humiliated, yes, but she had also found her courage in that very moment. Round them, the party dissolved into chaos. Small groups gathered, whispering and pointing, some openly confronting each other about whether they had known anything. A few guests slipped out quietly, uncomfortable with the intensity, but most stayed, unwilling to miss what was turning into the biggest scandal their circle had ever seen. At the bar, two men debated whether the betrayed husband had done the right thing by exposing it publicly. "It's humiliating," one said. "Why air it out here?" The other shook his head. "Humiliating? The humiliation didn't start tonight. It started when they decided to cheat. He just gave the truth a stage. And honestly, I respect him for it." Back in the center, the wife of the cheating man broke down completely. She turned to her husband one last time, her eyes red with tears. "We're finished. Don't come home tonight. Don't come home at all." The words hit him harder than anything else. His shoulders slumped, his eyes darted away, and for once, the man who always walked into every room with confidence looked utterly defeated. The betrayed husband, though, didn't feel triumph. He felt strangely empty. Revenge hadn't brought joy, it had brought truth, and with truth came consequences. He looked at his wife, who was staring at the floor, too ashamed to meet his eyes. For years, she had been his partner in everything. Tonight, she was a stranger. He spoke softly, but his words carried weight. "We're leaving." The room parted as he walked toward the door, his wife following a few steps behind. Her head hung low. The whispers grew louder, the drama far from over, but he didn't care anymore. He had said what he came to say. The rest would unfold in time. Behind him, the man's wife stood surrounded by friends who rushed to comfort her. The cheating man stood alone, abandoned, his mask shattered. And the party, which had started as a night of celebration, ended as a night no one would ever forget. For the betrayed husband, though, this was only the beginning of the aftermath. The real battles, divorce papers, trust issues, healing would come later. But tonight, he had done what many couldn't. He stood tall, told the truth, and walked away with his dignity intact. The morning after the party felt strangely quiet. He woke up early, long before the sun had fully risen, and sat in the living room, staring at the blank wall. The events of the night replayed in his mind like a movie he couldn't turn off. The gasps, the tears, the anger, the silence, all of it was still heavy in the air. His wife hadn't said much on the ride home. She sat in the passenger seat, arms folded tightly across her chest, staring out the window as if the passing streetlights could offer her answers. Now, in the daylight, she was still avoiding his eyes, moving silently round the house like a guest rather than a partner. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table. For years, that table had been a place of shared meals, small jokes, and late-night talks. But now it felt like a courtroom bench, waiting for someone to speak the truth. Finally, she broke the silence. Her voice was low, almost timid. "You didn't have to do it that way." He looked at her, his eyes tired. "And how else should I have done it? Keep living a lie? Pretend nothing was happening while you smiled at me during the day and sneaked away at night? No, it had to end, and it had to end publicly. Otherwise, you'd keep hiding." She swallowed hard, guilt flashing across her face. "I made a mistake. I lost control. But I didn't mean for it to go that far. His laugh was bitter. Didn't mean for it to go that far? It didn't just happen. You made choices. Over and over. That's not a mistake, that's a decision. The silence stretched again, heavy and painful. She wanted to speak, but every word seemed to dissolve before reaching her lips. Meanwhile, outside their home, the story of last night had already begun to spread. Friends who had been at the party wasted no time in sharing what they'd witnessed. Group chats buzzed with shock, judgment, and speculation. By mid-morning, nearly everyone in their social circle knew. Some people sent him messages of support, quietly admiring his courage. "I can't believe you stood up like that," one text read. Most people would have kept it hidden. "You did the right thing." Others, however, thought differently. "It should have stayed private," another message said. Now everyone knows, and it's messy, but he didn't care what they thought. For him, the truth was never meant to stay hidden, not when it had already poisoned so much of his life. Later that afternoon, he received a call from a mutual friend. The man's wife, the one who had been betrayed alongside him, had packed her things and gone to stay with her parents. She wasn't answering her husband's calls, wasn't responding to his desperate texts. She had made her decision. The cheating man, however, was furious. He blamed him for ruining his marriage by exposing the affair in public. "You didn't have to humiliate me," he shouted over the phone. "We could have settled this like adults." But the betrayed husband only replied with a steady voice, "If you wanted to settle it like an adult, you shouldn't have destroyed 2 marriages in the first place. Don't blame me for telling the truth. Blame yourself for giving me the truth to tell." Then he hung up. That night, he sat with his wife again. This time, she finally cried. Real tears, not the panic-driven ones from the party, but tears that came from realizing what she had lost. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I ruined everything. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I was looking for something I felt I lost here. Maybe I was selfish. But I never stopped loving you." He looked at her for a long time, but the words didn't move him. He had heard them before, in different forms, and they no longer carried weight. Love without loyalty isn't love. It's just comfort, and comfort isn't enough for me anymore. Her sobs filled the room, but he didn't comfort her this time. For years, he had been the one to patch up problems, smooth over rough edges, and hold their life together. But tonight, he felt something different, a strength in walking away from her tears. The fallout wasn't limited to their marriage alone. Friends began to take sides. Some distanced themselves completely, not wanting to be caught in the middle. Others aligned with him, openly criticizing his wife and her lover. Their once tightly knit group now felt fractured, every bond shaken by the weight of betrayal. Families got involved too. His own family called to express their shock, his mother's voice filled with sorrow. "You didn't deserve this," she said, her voice cracking. His wife's family, on the other hand, reached out privately, begging him to reconsider, to forgive her, to not let years of marriage go to waste. But forgiveness wasn't something he could just hand out like a spare key. Not now. Not when the trust that once formed the foundation of their lives had been completely shattered. That night, he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. His wife was in the next room, too ashamed to share the same space. The house felt heavy with silence, the kind of silence that tells you things will never be the same again. He wasn't sure what the future held. Divorce, maybe. Separation, likely. Healing, hopefully. But one thing he knew for certain, the man who walked into that party last night was not the same man lying in this bed tonight. He was no longer silent, no longer blind, no longer willing to live in the shadows of someone else's choices. The fallout had begun, and the ripples would spread for weeks, maybe months. But at least now, the truth was out. And truth, no matter how painful, was better than living a lie. Weeks passed since the party, but the echoes of that night lingered everywhere. What had once been a close circle of friends now felt like a cracked mirror, broken into sharp pieces that no one dared to pick up. People still whispered, still pointed, still rattled the story as if it were a tale too scandalous to forget. For him, the days felt quieter but heavier. The house had changed. His wife still lived there, but the silence between them was unbearable. They no longer shared meals at the kitchen table. She kept to one side of the house, he to the other. Like to strangers forced to coexist under the same roof. The trust was gone. And once trust is gone, everything else feels hollow. He tried to go about his routine work errands. Simple daily habits, but even those felt different now. People at work gave him looks, some filled with pity, others with respect. They all knew. He didn't have to explain. His wife tried, in small ways, to repair the damage. She left notes on the table. "I'm sorry." She offered to cook dinner. She even suggested counseling. But he wasn't sure if counseling could fix something that was already broken at the core. He listened politely, but his heart no longer leaned toward forgiveness. Meanwhile, the other couple's life had completely unraveled. The man's wife had filed for separation. She moved out of their shared home and returned to her parents, taking her dignity with her. People admired her strength. She hadn't just cried and collapsed, she had stood tall, spoken her truth, and walked away. Her story inspired others, especially women who had once stayed silent in similar situations. The cheating man, on the other hand, became a shadow of his former self. His once confident walk, his loud laugh, his smooth charm all gone. Friends avoided him. Colleagues whispered about him. His reputation, once carefully polished, had shattered overnight. He blamed others, of course blamed the betrayed husband, blamed bad timing, blamed anything except himself. But deep down, even he must have known the only person responsible was the one staring back at him in the mirror. As for the betrayed husband, he found himself receiving messages from unexpected people. Old acquaintances reached out, saying they respected him for how he handled it. Some even shared their own stories of betrayal, things they had kept buried for years. He realized then that what happened to him wasn't rare, it was just rarely spoken about. One evening, while walking through the park alone, he thought about how far he had come. A few months ago, he was blind to what was happening in his own home. Then he was angry, consumed by the betrayal. Then came the party, where he finally let the truth out. And now here he was, no longer angry, but strangely at peace. The pain hadn't disappeared, it still lived inside him, but it no longer controlled him. When he got home that night, his wife was waiting in the living room. She looked tired, her face pale from restless nights. She stood up slowly, her voice trembling. "I know you'll never see me the same again. I don't expect forgiveness anymore. But I need to say this, I'm sorry. Not just for the affair, but for the lies, for breaking the home we built together. If you want me to leave, I'll go." Her words were honest this time. He could hear it, but honesty didn't change the past. He sat down, looked at her carefully, and spoke quietly. "I don't hate you. I don't even wish you harm. But I also don't know if I can live with you the same way again. Some wounds heal, but some scars remind you every day of what was lost. I can't pretend it never happened." She wiped her tears, nodding. "Then maybe we need to let go." The words hung in the air. They both knew what they meant. The marriage had reached its end. Not with a fight, not with a dramatic exit, but with quiet acceptance that some things simply cannot be repaired. The following week, he packed a few things and moved temporarily into a small apartment closer to his work. It wasn't much, just a bed, a table, and a window with a view of the city, but it felt peaceful. It was his space, his fresh start. Friends visited him, bringing food, encouragement, and conversation. Some tried to cheer him up, others just listened. For the first time in a long while, he felt surrounded by genuine care. Not the shallow smiles of people pretending everything was perfect. Slowly, he began to rebuild himself. He started jogging in the mornings, something he hadn't done in years. He signed up for a cooking class, not because he needed to, but because he wanted to do something new for himself. He even found himself laughing again, really laughing. Something he thought he had forgotten how to do. The betrayal was still a part of his story, but it was no longer the whole story. It was a chapter, a painful one, but it wasn't the ending. One night, as he sat by the window in his new apartment, sipping tea and watching the city lights flicker, he realized something important. His revenge had never really been about humiliating anyone. It had been about reclaiming his dignity, his voice, and his truth. And in that, he had succeeded. His wife's lover was disgraced. His wife was left to face her choices. The other woman had found her strength. And he had found himself again. The road ahead would still be difficult, papers to sign, feelings to untangle, a life to reshape. But for the first time in months, he felt something he thought was lost forever. Hope. Time has a strange way of healing and reminding at the same time. Months had passed since that unforgettable night, and yet its echoes still followed him. People in his circle no longer talked about it openly, but every now and then, he could feel the weight of curious eyes or hear the faint whispers when he walked into a room. He didn't mind. For him, the storm had already passed. What remained was a quiet strength he had never felt before. The divorce papers were signed in silence. There were no shouting matches, no long, drawn-out battles. His wife accepted the reality, perhaps because deep down she knew there was no path back. She had tried to apologize countless times, but even she realized that her words could not rebuild the trust she had destroyed. They parted ways quietly, their years together reduced to a few signatures on paper. He moved forward, not with bitterness, but with a kind of clarity. The pain had shaped him, yes, but it hadn't destroyed him. It had carved out a stronger, wiser version of himself. He no longer felt the need to prove anything to anyone. His dignity had already been restored. The night he stood in that crowded party and let the truth speak for itself, the cheating man, however, lived a very different story. His wife had left him, and their separation became permanent. Friends who once admired him distanced themselves, uncomfortable with his arrogance and the wreckage he left behind. He was still around, of course, but now whenever his name came up in conversation, it was no longer accompanied by admiration. It was followed by sighs, shakes of the head, or a simple phrase that summed it up. He ruined his own life, and that, perhaps, was the greatest revenge of all. Not revenge fueled by shouting, not revenge driven by cruelty, but the kind of revenge where the guilty simply lived long enough to face the consequences of their choices. One evening, while walking through the market, he saw the man from a distance. Once the center of attention, he now moved quietly, head down, avoiding eye contact. Their eyes met for just a second, and in that second, everything was said without words. The man looked away first, unable to hold the gaze. That, to him, was victory. His ex-wife, too, had faded from his life. She tried reaching out a few times after the divorce, not to reconcile, but to explain herself again. But he no longer needed explanations. He had already moved on emotionally. She had to live with the choices she made, and he didn't owe her the comfort of listening anymore. Meanwhile, the other betrayed spouse, the woman who had stood by his side during that confrontation, had become a quiet inspiration in her own way. They remained in touch, not romantically, but as to people bound by a shared pain. Sometimes they spoke about the night that changed everything, sometimes about ordinary things like work or family. Their bond was built not on bitterness, but on mutual respect for the strength it took to walk through betrayal and still stand tall. Slowly, he began to find joy in small things again. Early morning walks, new hobbies, conversations with genuine friends. The laughter he thought he had lost returned, not loud and forced, but soft and real. People noticed the change. They no longer saw a man defined by betrayal, they saw a man who had risen above it. And that was the truth. His revenge wasn't just about exposing lies. It was about proving, to himself more than anyone else, that betrayal would not define him, that he could lose everything and still find a way to rebuild, that he could walk away from the ashes of his old life and create something better, something stronger. One night, he sat on his apartment balcony, the city lights glowing in the distance. He thought about the journey, the suspicion, the discovery, the party, the confrontation, the fallout, and finally, the quiet rebuilding of his life. It hadn't been easy. It hadn't been simple. But he realized that he was no longer the man who once sat at the kitchen table in shock, holding a cup of coffee with shaking hands. He was someone new. And in that realization, he smiled. His revenge had been complete. Not because he had destroyed anyone, but because he had rebuilt himself. The guilty were left with their shame, their broken marriages, their fractured reputations. He, on the other hand, walked forward with his dignity intact and his future open. The most stunning part, the part that left everyone truly speechless, wasn't the confrontation itself, but how he chose to rise afterward. People expected him to fall apart, to drown in bitterness, to lash out endlessly. Instead, He chose peace. He chose growth. He chose himself. And so, his story wasn't one of loss, but of transformation. His revenge wasn't fire and fury, it was calm, quiet, undeniable strength. As he finished his tea and looked up at the night sky, he whispered to himself, almost like a promise, "This isn't the end. This is just the beginning."